Hey, toy fans and toy professionals. Scott ToyGuru Neitlich here, and I've been in the toy industry for over 20 years. I have worked on a ton of toys, licensed toys, homegrown toys, toys of lots of different scales. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The importance of scale, the origin of different toy scales, and how understanding your customer, your toy collector, your kid player, whoever it is the key to choosing the right scale to make an action figure line. So where to start? There's a ton of action figure scales out there. There are what you would sort of call the Smurf scale, the little PVC figures, 3 3/4, 6-inch, 12-inch. Heck, I've even seen figures that are 48 inches tall. Okay, well, actually, I've worked on action figures that are 48 inches tall. Lots of scales that I've had the pleasure and privilege to work on over the years. But it isn't just about putting a figure out because you can. It's about putting out a figure because you should. When you're choosing the scale to produce, collect, or play with, scale is everything. Figures that are out of scale are honestly line killers and revenue killers. Alright, so the first scale I want to talk about is 3 3/4, which just means 3 3/4 inches. And a lot of times when you say this, you will immediately think of Star Wars. And there's a very good reason. It wasn't the first 3 3/4 line, but it was the first to really break through. Now, why 3 3/4? Why was Star Wars done at this scale? Well, something that a lot of collectors and toy fans of all ages don't really know is that Star Wars was not originally an action figure line. It was conceived in the 70s as a vehicle line. The executives and toy makers at Kenner thought that what fans of Star Wars were going to want to purchase from the entertainment, from the movie, was vehicles, not action figures, not characters. They thought the vehicles were really the star of the show. That's why the vehicles are all very detailed and interact with the figures. The figures were essentially accessories to go with the vehicles, kind of like Ken is an accessory to go with Barbie. Now, obviously, this didn't last, and the figures rapidly outsold in both dollars and, shall we say, popularity versus the vehicles. And by the sequels, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, the line was quickly moving into a figure-based line. But originally, it was based on vehicles. And so the 3 3/4 scale was created in order to have the figures be compatible. And it was created by this gentleman, Mark Bardot, who is now with Hasbro. He was with Kenner. He was the one who first suggested that 3 3/4 would work based on the size of the vehicles and having the figures fit inside of them. How did he come up with this? Well, the extremely scientific method was he simply held out his hand with his thumb and his forefinger and said, this is a good size for an action figure that'll fit inside of the cockpit. And all of the vehicles were scaled around that size figure based on the size of Mark's hand. So we all have Mark's hand to thank for that. And again, there were 3 3/4 figures before Star Wars, but this was the size that fit between his thumb and his forefinger. And that is the size that they made the first figure, Luke, off of. Luke is exactly 3 3/4 inches tall. Now, there were obviously characters that were going to be shorter than Luke and characters that were going to be taller than Luke. So as the line was designed, Darth Vader was a little bit taller, Chewbacca was a little taller, R2-D2 was a little shorter, Princess Leia was even just a tad shorter, but they were all in that scale. G.I. Joe, seeing the success of Star Wars, was very quick to jump on the 3 3/4 bandwagon. And of course, this very quickly became a big bandwagon with many lines doing figures at this successful scale, including one of my all-time favorite, the Kraken! That amazing Clash of the Titans line from Mattel. Classic toys. Aren't they just awesome? The 80s really was a golden age. 3 3/4, though, went far beyond the 80s, and today you see almost any property done in 3 3/4. And some of the figures are better than others, but the scale does live on, and we're going to see it for years to come. Alright, so 6-inch, the other big scale you see a lot of figures in. And this is a scale where a lot of characters can live together. Now again, there were 6-inch figures for years and decades, but it really was this guy here, Jesse Falcon, who ran the Toy Biz Marvel Legends line, the original one. He now works for Marvel. He was the one who first came up with the idea of doing a super articulated 6-inch figure. The idea came from him noticing the 12-inch military figures that were at market, and these figures often came with a ton of accessories. In particular, he was really looking at some of the rifles and the guns that came with these figures and realizing that the guns themselves had articulation. They had more detail sometimes than the figure itself. And he said, well, why don't we apply this to an action figure? And he did. And that became the very first Spider-Man Classics line, which really was the birth of the highly articulated 6-inch figure, which truly dominates the collecting market today. And of course, as we all know, this line simply rolled into the much larger Toy Biz line and became Marvel Legends, which put out hundreds of characters in 6-inch scale and kind of helped set the standard for doing 6-inch figures with a ton of articulation, which of course led to the Marvel Legends line from Hasbro, which just expanded on what Toy Biz had done in the past. And of course, the influence and success at market of this line was only going to branch out to other companies such as Mattel with the DC Universe Classics line, which I had the privilege of working on for the bulk of that line, and even things like the Black Series line from Hasbro with Star Wars, where you had a traditional 3 3/4 line now being brought into the 6-inch scale. Now, one of the drawbacks to 6-inch can be vehicles. They can be and have been done, but they need to be pretty big, unless you're dealing with kind of a one-man sort of land speeder, if you will, is a good example. This is not a land speeder, this is a TIE fighter. When you're going with something bigger like the TIE fighter, it's tough. It's tough to get a price point. It's tough to move these at market simply because they have to be so huge. 6-inch isn't always ideal when you're looking at vehicle play and vehicle collecting. But if your goal is to display your figures and have a ton of characters in exactly the pose you want them in, 6-inch can often be ideal for this because it allows for articulation you just can't do with 3 3/4 or other scales. Alright, so now let's conclude with why scale matters. What we're looking at here is a series of Superman figures, including Mattel figures, including DC Direct, leading up to that McFarlane figure on the far right, which is 7 inches. So the reason I'm using this example is not only is it current at market, but you can see 7-inch figures. What am I going to do with a 7-inch figure? Every super articulated figure I own is 6-inch in scale. And now here comes along McFarlane making 7-inch figures. Now it may be contractual, it may be a creative choice, it may be a legal requirement. I don't work for McFarlane. I've never actually worked for McFarlane. I don't work for them currently, so I don't have an insight into why they chose 7-inch. But as a consumer and a collector and a toy maker myself, I can tell you that this is a very confusing choice. Another example is the Bandai Thundercats Classics line. When this was first announced that it was going to be an 8-inch line, my immediate reaction was, why? Again, every other figure I have that's highly articulated is all in the 6-inch scale. I even went to my friends at Warner Brothers Consumer Products that I was working with on the DC line, and they told me that the rationale that Bandai had used was that the classic vintage line was 8-inch. So of course they should be making their modern collector figures to mimic this classic scale. And immediately I started pulling my hair out because I said, but well, look at the He-Man classics, Motu classics that we're doing right now. You don't see us doing these at 5 inches. You see us doing these at the scale that all other figures are at. For a collector, figures need to be able to fit into a cohesive world. Just because a line was done in the 80s or the past doesn't mean it should just be replicated. You have to think, who is the customer? Who is the consumer? Who is the collector? Who is the kid or parent who is buying this product? How are they going to interact with it? Are they going to play? Are they going to display? That should be the motivating factor. Having scale and having figures work in scale is so important because collectors want everything to fit. They want everything to be neat. Let's face it, we all have OCD. We all are obsessive compulsive about our collections. And that is what my company is all about. Spectre Creative looks at the emotional needs first, not maximizing appeal in a traditional 4-quadrant model. When you understand the emotional needs, such as having things match and having scales match, it's not just going to lead to better product, it's going to lead to better sales. Putting out product that doesn't fit in scale with other characters is going to affect the bottom line, which is why understanding scale and understanding the pluses and minuses of all scales and what they allow the end consumer to do is so important. If you're not thinking of it in these terms, then honestly you're missing the boat. When you have something like 3 3/4, well, much like the vintage Star Wars line, the number one thing is going to be interaction with vehicles. 3 3/4 is a perfect scale to work for vehicle play because it can be done inexpensive enough and size-wise to work. When you're dealing with 6-inch, we're talking much more about display because the articulation level that 6-inch allows gives the collector the ability to display the figure exactly how they want, and that gives them control over this character. And that's a big part of understanding the emotional needs of the consumer. If you're just looking at consumers as a giant group and not realizing that collectors and kids have very, very different emotional needs and connections to toy product, then again, you're just throwing stuff out there to see what's going to stick. And in today's market, that's not a wise way to be producing toy product. So if you're ready to put out a toy line, whether it's a kid line, a collector line, a line for parents, or even a niche market, that's what Spectre Creative does. We help you understand the emotional needs of the consumer. We are staffed with therapists, psychiatrists, parents, and toy makers who all understand the emotion-first approach. So if you need help with branding, content creation, retail solutions, or really understanding the emotional connection between your customers and your product, this is what we do best, and we love helping toy companies, manufacturers, and really any industry maximize the skill set. Check us out at spectrecreative.com. We would love to know how we can help you understand your customers' emotional needs.